The swaying had come to a halt and it was dark. The explorer was not comfortable in this alien air. It felt thick as soup, and he had to breathe shallowly. Even so, he reached out in a sudden need for company. The merchant was warm to the touch. His breathing was rough. He moved occasionally in spasm, and was obviously asleep. The explorer hesitated and decided not to wake him. It would serve no real purpose. There would be no rescue, of course. That was the penalty paid for high profits, which unrestrained competition could lead to. The merchant who opened up a new planet could have a 10-year monopoly in its trade, which he might have to hug to himself, or more likely rent it out to all comers at a stiff price. It followed that planets were searched for in secrecy and preferably away from the usual trade routes. In a case such as theirs, there was little or no chance another ship would come within range of their sub-etherics, except for the most improbable of coincidences. Even if they were in their ship, that is, rather than this cage. The explorer grasped at the thick bars. Even if they blasted those away, which they could, they would still be stuck too high in the open air for leaping. It was too bad. They'd landed twice before in the scout ship. They'd established contact with the natives, who were grotesquely huge but mild and unaggressive. It was obvious that they had once owned a flourishing technology, but hadn't faced up to the consequences of such a technology. It would have been a wonderful market. And it was a tremendous world. The merchant especially had been taken aback. He'd known the figures that had expressed the planet's diameter, but from a distance of 2 light seconds he stood at the visiplate and muttered, "Unbelievable." "Oh, there's larger worlds," the explorer said. It wouldn't do for an explorer to be too easily impressed. "Inhabited?" "Well, no." "Why, you could drop your entire planet into that large ocean and drown it." The explorer smiled. It was a gentle dig at his Arcturian homeland, which was smaller than most planets. He said, not quite." The merchant followed along the line of thoughts. "And the inhabitants? They're as large in proportion to their world?" He sounded as though the news struck him as somewhat less favorably now. "Nearly 10 times our height." "Are you sure that they're friendly?" "Well, that's hard to say. Friendship between alien intelligences is an imponderable. They're not dangerous, I think. We've come across other groups that could not maintain equilibrium after the atomic war stage, and you know the results. Introversion, retreat, gradual decadence, and increasing gentleness. Even if they are such monsters, well, the principle remains." It was about then that the explorer felt this heavy throbbing of the engines. He frowned and said, "We're descending a bit too quickly." There had been some speculation on the dangers of landing some hours before. The planetary target was huge for an oxygen water world. Though it lacked the size of the uninhabitable hydrogen-ammonia planets, and its low density made its surface gravity fairly normal, its gravitational forces fell off, but slowly with distance. In short, the gravitational potential was high, and the ship's calculator was a run-of-the-mill model, not designed to plot landing trajectories on that potential range. That meant the pilot would have to use manual controls. It would have been wiser to install a more powerful model, but that would have meant a trip to some outpost of civilization, lost time, and perhaps a lost secret. The merchant demanded on an immediate landing. The merchant felt it necessary to defend his position now. He said angrily to the explorer, "Don't you think the pilot knows its job? He landed you safely twice before." Yes, thought the explorer, in a scout ship, not this unmaneuverable freighter. Aloud, he said nothing. He kept his eye on the visiplate. They were descending much too quickly. There was no room for doubt. Much too quickly. The merchant said peevishly, "Why do you keep your silence?" "Well then, if you wish me to speak, I would suggest that you strap on your floater and help me prepare the ejector." The pilot fought a noble fight. He was no beginner. The atmosphere, abnormally high and thick in the gravitational potential of this world, whipped and burned about the ship, but to the very last it looked like he might be able to bring it a control despite that. He even maintained course, following the extrapolated line to the point on the northern continent to where they were headed. Under other circumstances, with a shade more luck, the story would have eventually been told and retold as a heroic and masterly reversal of a lost situation. But with insight of victory, tired body and tired nerves clamped a control bar with a shade too much pressure, and the ship, which had almost leveled off, dipped down again. There was no room to retrieve from the final error. There was only a mile left to fall. The pilot remained at his post for the actual landing, his only thought of breaking the force of the crash, of maintaining space-worthiness of the vessel. He did not survive. With the ship bucking madly in a soupy atmosphere, few ejectors could be mobilized, and only one of them in time. When afterwards the explorer lifted out of unconsciousness and rose to his feet, he had a definite feeling that, but himself and the merchant, there were no survivors. And perhaps that was even an overcalculation. His floater had burnt out while still sufficiently distant from the surface to have the fall stun him. The merchant might have had less luck. He was surrounded by a world of thick, ropey stalks of grass, and in the distance were trees that reminded him vaguely of similar structures in his native Arcturian world, except their lowest branches were high above what would be considered normal treetops. He called, his voice sounding basso in the thick air, and the merchant answered. The explorer made his way towards him, thrusting violently as the coarse stalks barred his path. "Are you hurt?" The merchant grimaced. "I've sprained something. It hurts to walk." The explorer probed him gently. "I don't think anything's broken. You'll have to walk despite the pain." "Can't we rest first?" "It's important to try to find the ship. If it's space-worthy, or if it can even be repaired, we may live. Otherwise, we won't." Just a few minutes. Let me catch my breath." The explorer was glad enough for those few minutes. The merchant's eyes were already closed. He allowed his to do the same. He heard the trampling, and then his eyes snapped open. Never sleep on a strange planet, he told himself futilely. The merchant was awake too, and his steady screaming was a rumble of terror. The explorer called, "It's only a native of the planet. It won't harm you." But even as he spoke, the giant had swooped down, and in the moment they were in its grasp, being lifted closer to its monstrous ugliness. The merchant struggled violently, and of course quite futilely. "Can't you talk to it?" he yelled. The explorer could only shake his head. "I can't reach it with the projector. It won't be listening." "Then blast it! Blast it down! We can't do that." The phrase "you fool" had almost been added. The explorer struggled to keep self-control. They were swallowing space as the monster moved purposely away. "Why not?" cried the merchant. "You can reach your blaster. I see it in plain sight. Don't be afraid of falling." "It's simpler than that. If this monster is killed, you'll never be able to trade with this planet. You'll never even be able to leave it. You probably won't live the day out." "Why?" "Because this is one of the young of the species. You should know what happens when a trader kills a native young, even accidentally. What's more, this is the target point. Then we're in the state of a powerful native. This might even be one of his brood." And that was how they entered their present prison. They had carefully burnt away a portion of the thick, stiff covering, and it was obvious from the height that they were suspended was a killing one. Now, once again, the prison cage shuddered and was lifted upward in an arc. The merchant rolled to the lower rim and startled awake. The cover lifted and light flooded in, and as was the case the time before, there were two specimens of the young. They were not very different in appearance from the adults of the species, reflected the explorer. Of course, they were considerably smaller. A handful of reedy green stalks were stuffed between the bars, its odor not unpleasant, but it carried clods of soil on its ends. The merchant drew away and said huskily, "What are they doing?" The explorer said, "Trying to feed us. At least, this seems to be the native equivalent of grass." The cover was replaced, and they were set swinging again, alone with their fodder.